Hey everybody, Mark here. So today we're looking at keto diets, but before we jump into it, I just wanted to let you know that although we have the full version of the video up on YouTube and also on the blog, we realized it was actually quite long when we completed it. So we've split it into segments looking at weight loss and general health, and for this iteration, which is looking at diabetes by itself. So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll jump in from where we picked up, and I hope you enjoy it. See you later. There's a ketogenic diet. Okay, like all the videos, the first thing we need to do is define what we're talking about. So a ketogenic diet, otherwise known as a keto diet, is when you have very low levels of carbohydrates in your diet. And what this allows your body to do then is use up its glycogen and glucose stores from the liver, the kidneys, and just in circulation. But then because you haven't got any glucose in your body needs to do two things to compensate. One, it needs to make additional glucose from fat and protein via a process called gluconeogenesis. Don't worry too much about the fancy words. It's just a process where we're making glucose that helps to fuel the central nervous system and the brain. However, you're not getting the optimal amount that your body requires, so the body picks up the slack using a different process. And this is a different pathway from fat metabolism, where your body breaks down the usual fatty acids for energy, but it also produces something called ketones, which can also act as a fuel source for the brain and the central nervous system. For those that are interested, I actually have a blog on the site all about ketosis and how that's generated. So if you're interested, take a look. And it could be an interesting watch for you. Now, everyone will produce some form of ketones, so actually it's quite a natural process. But as you reduce your carbohydrate intake and therefore your glucose supplies in your body needs to react, and therefore it upregulates the breakdown of fat, which is the basis of the diet, because if you're mobilizing fat and your fat stores, the theory is that you'll start to lose more weight. So that's the concept of the keto diet. To put this into practice on a day-to-day basis, it means people are primarily relying on protein-based foods like meat, fish, cheese, eggs, nuts, also spreads like butter and oils, and that kind of really makes up the bulk of the diet. It also means then that people will have very small amounts of starch, if any at all actually. It means they generally have quite low levels of vegetables and fruits because they do contain some carbohydrates. And also, if you really want to be in ketosis, you can't be having any things like sweets, biscuits, chocolate, cakes, etc. because they're all loaded with sugar, which is turned into glucose in your body and therefore will kick you out of ketosis. Okay, good start. Let's keep going. Keto diets and diabetes. All right, so let's look at diabetes then. So we have a few different types of diabetes. We have type 2 diabetes, we have type 1 diabetes, and we have everything in between, but these are the two main ones that we're going to focus on. Now, in both diseases, or both conditions, it's carbohydrates in your diet have the potential to spike your glucose levels. So carbohydrates are turned into glucose, which is what essentially diabetes is. It's high glucose levels. Now in type 2 diabetes, it's not just about the diet. It's also fat around the liver and around the pancreas that causes your blood glucose levels to rise in the first place. So treating that underlying cause through weight loss and physical activity actually helps normalize your blood glucose levels so you're able to tolerate these foods once again. But if you're not able to do that, then actually, yes, reducing the amount of carbohydrates in your diet will help lower your blood glucose levels. And actually, the research for keto diets, it does look quite clear that people that follow keto diets need less medication. So they might need less insulin, and they can also reduce the number of therapies that they're on, particularly the ones that initiate more insulin production, like sulfonylureas, or actually lower the doses of their insulin that they're taking. In type 1 diabetes, so this is slightly different about how this one comes about, as these patients do not produce any of their own insulin. It's still carbohydrates that increase their blood glucose levels, so they will need to take additional insulin injections whenever they eat a significant amount of carbohydrates. So by eating less carbohydrates, they need to take less injections. So once again, actually, people that go on to ketogenic diets from an anecdotal perspective, their glucose levels do tend to be quite stable, but it doesn't mean that everyone that eats carbohydrates suddenly has erratic glucose levels. I see a lot of patients that also have very stable glucose levels despite the fact that they are eating carbohydrates. So let's look at the cons now. Now the cons that I'm going to focus on are primarily in type 1 diabetes, but we'll make reference to type 2. So let's start with type 1. So type 1 diabetes, there is a condition that can manifest itself called diabetic ketoacidosis. Now, I won't bore you too much with the details, but let's just say it's bad times. And this happens when your body doesn't have enough insulin on board to control your blood glucose levels, so you start breaking down a vast number of ketones and they start to rise uncontrollably. Your body becomes very acidic, and essentially before we invented insulin, this led to death in these patients. So really bad times. Now the problem with a keto diet is if you're running a baseline of ketones in your body, if you start to fall into a situation where your body's really increasing its keto levels, you haven't got enough insulin on board, you're sick, your body's stressed for whatever reason, it can tip you into that process much easier. The other thing as well is that if you're testing for ketones, then if you're following a diet that makes you produce ketones at a higher level than what you'd normally would, it can be difficult to recognize when it might become a problem. So it could mask when you're starting to produce ketones in a negative way as opposed just through dietary means. So I'd always suggest that people with type 1 diabetes, you can follow a low carbohydrate diet, but I wouldn't drop below that 50 grams per day to generate ketones as a baseline because it can just be dangerous. In type 2 diabetes, now it's not the same sort of thing because your bodies do produce some of their own insulin. So you tend to have a bit of protection with regards to ketones rising too high. One of the times that it can become a problem is if you're taking a medication called an SGLT2 inhibitor. Now these basically make you pee, so they can dehydrate you, and if you're starting to produce ketones and you become unwell, it can concentrate the ketones in your body because you're becoming dehydrated, and it can also push you into that diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA as we call it. And we've seen a number of patients in recent times come in with this. So if you're taking one of these medications, they end in gliflozin, dapagliflozin, canagliflozin, empagliflozin. If you're taking one of these and you're on a keto diet, my suggestion would be speak to your diabetes team to see if you can come off that medication or get out of ketosis and eat a little bit more than 50 grams per day because it can be dangerous. One of the other key drawbacks that we need to discuss with diabetes and keto diets is the hypo risk. Now, the first thing is actually just having a low carbohydrate diet can make your glucose levels run a little bit too tight so that you're susceptible to hypoglycemic episodes, particularly when you're doing other things that help lower your glucose levels like exercise. Also in type 2 diabetes, if you're taking the other medications other than insulin that lower blood glucose levels significantly, like sulfonylureas, you'll know these as things like gliclazide, they tend to end in zide or mide, typically speaking. These can also cause drops in your glucose levels. So if you're taking those medications and you decide to go on a keto diet, again, it's a really good idea to time with your diabetes team to explore your options. The other risk when it comes to hypos and diabetes is if you're following a keto diet, then you're exhausting your supplies of glycogen, which is stored glucose from your liver and your kidneys and your muscles. Now, usually when you experience a hypoglycemic episode, not only do you have to treat it with sugar and then do a follow-on treatment with some more slowly releasing carbohydrate, but your body would kick in and help get you out of it. So your liver would kick out a bunch of glucose to help combat that. But obviously, if you're running a base level of almost zero glucose stored in your body, then it can just exacerbate those hypos. So if you're someone that's prone to hypos in particular, a keto diet might not be the way to go, and actually just just having some carbohydrates in your diet might be a good idea just to mitigate against that hypo risk. Because although it's the highs that over a prolonged period lead to most of the complications in diabetes, it's the hypos that can get you in an instant and can be very dangerous, and also they're not without their long-term complications with regards to cognition, and links to dementia and things like Alzheimer's as well. So we're really keen to avoid hypos if we can.